Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I would like to welcome all of you to the first panel of the 7th Abu Dhabi Strategic Debate ADSD, which is organized virtually this year by the Emirates Policy Center. EPC has dedicated the first theme to shed light on the outcome of the US presidential elections and their impact on the international and regional order. This panel attempts to foresee the impact of Biden winning on the White House on international order by discussing whether the new American administration will enhance its international responsibility or adopt an isolationist policy to tackle internal challenges represented by an unprecedented polarization, the health and the economic challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. The panel will also discuss Biden's foreign policy towards the two competing powers, China and Russia. We are delighted to have in this panel a select of renowned experts in international politics. Professor Kishore Mahbubani, who is currently a distinguished fellow at the Asia Research Institute National at University of Singapore. Also, we have, and we are honored to have Mr. Cliff Kopchan, who is a Eurasia Group Chairperson. And of course, honored also to have Mr. Richard Fontaine, who is the CEO of Center for New American Security in Washington. I would like to welcome the speakers and thank them for accepting our invitation to take part in the debate and this panel in particular. I would also like to welcome all our viewers who are watching this panel on EPC's account on all various social media platforms, as well on its YouTube channel and via Zoom application. Before I give the floor to the speaker, I would like to draw the attention of our Arab viewers that they can listen to simultaneous interpretation in Arabic by clicking on the French channel at the bottom of the screen. My dear guests, I would like to ask you a question. I will start with Professor Mahbubani. Professor Mahbubani, what are the key shifts on American domestic landscape that made all world powers pay great attention to this year's US presidential elections?
Well, let me say for a start that I think, like most of America, like many people in America, most of the world is actually very happy that Joe Biden hopefully has been elected and will become the next president of the United States of America. I do think that the past 4 years of the Donald Trump presidency have been very exhausting for the world. It's been so difficult to try and keep up with what he's doing, how he makes policies, how he issues tweets, and then how you have to react to his tweets. And so it's really been a very difficult and challenging environment, I think even for analysts around the world. I think so it's good for us that Joe Biden has become the president, but unfortunately, Joe Biden is becoming president at a time when he's facing, I would seriously say, a tsunami of problems within the United States of America. And the fact that 70 million, I mean, it's a record number. It's the second highest number a presidential candidate has got in the United States of America. 70 million people voted for Donald Trump. So it shows that it is not about Donald Trump. It's about the fact that there's some serious structural problems within American society. And I've written about this, and I've said it's become a plutocracy in the United States, and that's why lots of people are unhappy. These are the internal problems he's got to deal with, in addition to COVID-19, in addition to the economic slowdown. And at the same time, globally, United States, for the first time, is going to deal with a peer power in a way that he hasn't dealt with for over 100 years. The Soviet Union never came anywhere close to being as large as the United States, but China can. The Chinese economy can become larger than the American economy within 10 to 15 years. So it's a whole new ball game globally. So even though Joe Biden, I'm sure, is very happy that he's got the job, he's got the job at the most difficult time in American history in some ways. And those of us in the rest of the world, I think the only point I want to make is that we should do our best to help Joe Biden succeed.
Cliff, what do you think?
The election, in my view, is like my friend. I think that the real takeaway is not what changed, but what didn't change. This was a vote by half the country, slightly less than half, for America First. It shows. When I call my friends in Wisconsin, where I grew up, they are sad. They're very, very unhappy with the outcome. And I think it's important for everybody to realize that the celebrations we're seeing are just about exactly half of America. And half of America is not celebrating, they're grieving. It's almost two nations right now, I think. And what that tells us structurally about America is it really is two nations right now. I'm also struck by the outcome. If you look at some of the polling data in the outcome, the most important issue to many Americans, I guess again about slightly less than half, was not coronavirus, but it was the economy. And so you have a real divorce in people's minds as to what really matters. And finally, if you look at this sort of structural polling data, about 70% of Americans don't want our troops in harm's way. And I think that's also reflected in the outcome here and in the remarkable strength that this president showed. So I'd say the main impression that I come out of the last week with is that the forces that motivated President Trump to power are as strong as they have ever been. And the domestic landscape here is going to be very much split down the middle for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and I think this is indicate how much populism is spread. I mean, 70 million voted for Trump. It shows that populism is obvious there, and it's not going so quickly. But in terms of Richard, if we are talking about the other world, China, Russia, North Korea, how do you think this election, is it they took a breath when Trump lost, or how you see the impact on the global order?
Yeah, well, first, I think you're going to see a very different tone out of Washington and out of the White House than we've seen for the past 4 years. And the tone will have substantive implications, and you will also see different priorities, I think, out of the White House. So, the first set of priorities that will occupy the Biden administration will be COVID, and COVID. And that will be, largely domestically focused, but have international implications. The president-elect, Joe Biden, has made a big effort to demonstrate that he wants to break with the President Trump's approach to allies and demonstrate that the United States is reliable and consistent, diplomatically consistent in our approach, elevate climate change, where really today is nowhere on the foreign policy agenda to be, number one or number two or somewhere very close to the top, and then to continue the sort of overall competition with China. There's some tension among these various objectives. So, for example, it's unclear, at least, the degree to which the United States can both cooperate with China on climate change, but compete with China in all of these other areas in which we have a competitive relationship. The Biden administration wants to demonstrate that it's a good friend and reliable and a good ally. But the question is going to be, what does the United States want allies to do in exchange for that the confidence and fidelity and all of this? And then to what degree is COVID going to absorb the sort of domestic attention of the president and resources as we spend money to try to get back the economy and the back on track and so forth. And so I think you're going to see a less disruptive force in Washington when it comes to the kind of big questions of global order, but the big questions of global order aren't going to go away. And so they're going to still obtain, the new team is going to have to deal with them.
Professor Mahboubani, how will this election affect the shape of competition with China? Will Biden continue containment policy towards Beijing?
Well, I think I wouldn't say that the United States has been pursuing a containment policy against Beijing. I mean, clearly, in the last 4 years, the competition between US and China has become much, much stronger. And as you know, I've written a book called Has China Won, which I placed behind my shoulder to explain why this US-China competition is driven by structural forces, okay? And there are at least 3 structural forces driving it. Number one, I mean, for 2,000 years, and Graham Allison's written about this, whenever the world's number one emerging power is about to overtake the world's number one power, the world's number one power always pushes down the world's number one emerging power. This is like an iron law of history. So what the United States is doing in trying to push back China is, I think, perfectly normal superpower behavior. It's not abnormal at all. Secondly, of course, there's something called the yellow peril dimension, which makes the conflict much more emotional. And you see this reflected when people talk about the Kung flu, the China virus, hints of, the yellow peril dimension emerging. And thirdly, of course, there's a bipartisan consensus within the United States that is disappointed that China hasn't become a democracy like America, although future historians will be very puzzled that a young republic, the United States, assumed that a 4,000-year civilization could be transformed by a 250-year-old republic. But there is clearly strong forces that are driving this US-China geopolitical contest. But at the same time, I also want to emphasize that actually it is possible for the United States and China to live in peace with each other. Because if both sides want to focus on their current strategic goals, like number one, to improve the well-being of their people, that is the number one concern they both have. And number two, that they have a pressing issue of COVID-19, right? And one of the oldest rule of geopolitics is that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So if COVID-19 is an enemy of America and COVID-19 is an enemy of China, they should both come together to kill COVID-19 together, destroy it completely, and then they can go back to their geopolitical contest. And then, as Richard mentioned, that on issues like climate change, there's a complete convergence of interest between United States and China. So what is going to be the real challenge for Joe Biden is how he has, on the one hand, he'll be under a lot of political pressure to maintain the competition. I won't call it containment, competition with China. And on the other hand, there's equally strong reasons why he should cooperate with China also. And that's going to be very, very tough, because if he's seen to be soft on China, he'll be killed politically, killed. So that's a really impossible mission that he has. But again, but one small piece of advice I have is the Biden administration should send people into the rest of the world to listen to, for example, what are China's neighbors saying? They are of course concerned about China's rise, but they say we have to live with China. We cannot ignore China. So don't force countries to choose. So there are ways and means of managing this contest with China, whereby at the end of the day, the people of America are better off, and hopefully the rest of the world are also better off. The competition will continue, but let's find ways and means of making sure that it doesn't derail the world.
Cliff, before I ask you another question, I just want you to comment. I'm asking, by electing Joe Biden, does it mean that the United States is leaving bipolar and moving to multilateralism, which China always asking for?
Thank you. First, let me say that, just briefly, that as I've written, I think that we have been and will be in a bipolar world, and this isn't something that countries are really able to choose. It's kind of like gravity. It is. The U.S. and China, if you look at hard power, economic power, and military power, and if you look at soft power also, the United States on any ranking is far ahead of China. These two countries are the world's new superpowers, and that's the world we live in. And we talk about international order. I think it's really important to describe that order because people have very different conceptions of what it is. Not everybody will agree with me, but I think it's obvious that we live in a bipolar world. And that's good news. I'm a lot less unhappy about international politics than most people are, in that bipolar systems tend to be predictable, stable, and peaceful. And the countries, the hegemons that establish them, have an interest in sustaining them. So they tend to be pretty vigorous. I think that we are entering a peaceful period, which will see strong competition between the United States and China in the economic sphere. But again, this is not a Cold War. The Cold War had military balancing, military competition. This will have economic competition, which is just by definition much, much, much safer than the Cold War. So I'm hardly downbeat about where we're going, and that was true before the election and true after the election. I think we're going to live in a bipolar world, but one in which the American president will have a significantly more multilateral approach than the past president. Joe Biden, I worked on Capitol Hill for 10 years, and I saw him up close a lot. He has a deep conviction in working with allies, the importance of allies, and leveraging American power. He's about as different than Donald Trump as a human being could be in almost every respect. And so I do think that from working with allies to and maybe a new deal with Iran, we can come back to that. I think Joe Biden is going to be much more interested in global engagement.
So Cliff, you think will Biden's election be a decisive factor in reshaping the American model? Will he be able to reduce polarization and ideological and ethnic divisions inside the country? Will he succeed in renewing the U.S. power?
Well, I'll give you my answer. And again, I should say right up front that I'm not in consensus here, but if I was, I don't think you want me to be here. I think there are too many skeptics in the United States. Everything that the skeptics say is true. There is strong social drivers to populism, that as the economy and as the United States declines, they're going to retrench, and the democracy in America is becoming illiberal. In my view, consensus, common wisdom, far too much conflates Donald Trump with America. And they are very different. Yes, America produced Donald Trump, but then you got a feedback loop after Trump was elected, and things just snowballed. Joe Biden's not perfect. There are things in his background that you can find that I don't think even he'd be very proud of. But he is someone who has worked with Republicans. He's someone who can reach across the aisle. And I'm a centrist myself, but I think this is a man who can bring out the best in what was America, and I think what what will be America. I do think that there is still a center in American politics. It might be smaller, but it still exists, that can work with the other party. And I think if anybody on the scene, there are very few people on the American political scene right now that can activate that center. So if America is a dying dream, I think it will die more slowly than it would have without Joe Biden. And I think we political scientists can't conflate Donald Trump with the future. I think we have to be open to the forces that play in support of the American dream, as well as the ones that are inhibiting it. That's how I answer that.
Thank you, Cliff. Richard, what are the priorities of Biden's administration? Will it pay more attention to the home front than to foreign policy?
I think it's going to try to do both at the same time. I think the number one priority is going to be COVID and trying to get a handle on that. We saw even in the last 24 hours, the first thing that the Biden team did was appoint a special task force to deal with COVID. And you'll see some changes on that front. But internationally too, they will, I think, try to demonstrate to the world that they're big, at the beginning, symbolic breaks with 4 years of Donald Trump's approach. So on the multilateral front, they'll go back into the World Health Organization, they'll go back into the Paris Climate Accord, they'll go back into the JCPOA with Iran. They will say nice and supportive things about NATO and our allies. They'll call, the president will call our allies. He said that he would like to do a early summit of democratic leaders around the world. So there'll be a big push on the multilateral front. There also will be other things that I think they will do to demonstrate that there's kind of a new team in town. So again, symbolic at the beginning, but efforts to demonstrate that climate change is a major priority, taking some domestic regulatory and executive order measures in order to try to reverse some of the things that the Trump administration has done. So I think you will see a number of efforts very early to set a different tone, both domestically and in international terms, to try to suggest to Americans and to the world that the Trump sort of America first, highly personalized, very transactional, bilateral or unilateral tendency in foreign affairs is over. And now you have a much more multilateral, allied-centric, kind of approach. And then all of the inevitable challenges will still be there to be dealt with, and they'll have to start to work through those.
So you think, in terms of foreign policy, which one is coming or first? Is China, Russia, or Middle East? I mean, if they will start, I know all of them important for maybe the Middle East the least, but I mean, in terms of the foreign policy.
Yeah, well, China, they're going to have to address from the very beginning. I think the team is divided a little bit internally about what their overall sort of philosophical disposition should be toward China, whether it's sort of a mixture of cooperation and competition, or whether a more purely competitive nature for the relationship is inevitable. On top of that, the Chinese would love to see a reset of relations between the United States and China, where they sort of put an end to the confrontational style of the Trump administration, the tariffs, the trade deals, all this other stuff. I suspect that the Biden folks won't actually go for that, but certainly the Chinese will push that. And then, of course, the wild card in all this is, what do the North Koreans do to get back on the agenda? Because they have done everything over the past year to be provocative, except the things that irk Donald Trump the most. So they haven't done the long-range missile tests, and they haven't done the nuclear tests because they know that's what really bothers them. But they've done the short-range missile tests, and they've developed nuclear weapons. So they, at some point, which are still subject to all the sanctions they want to see eliminated, are going to force themselves back onto the agenda. And if I had to bet, that will happen in the first few months of a Biden administration, if not earlier.
Professor Mahboubani, and Cliff, the same question would be for you. How will the relations between US and Russia look like under Biden's administration? Will the US seek to confront Russia's expansion in Eastern Europe and Middle East? Professor Mahboubani?
Well, I suspect I may have to defer to Richard and Cliff, who probably have a better understanding and better feeling of the thinking of the Biden administration towards Russia. Although in my view, one of the most surprising things I say in my book, Has China Won, is that logically, if you look at Russia's long-term challenges, Russia's number one long-term challenge is not coming from Europe, not coming from United States. Russia's number one long-term challenge is the fact that it's got the longest border with China. And for a long time, Russia, especially the former Soviet Union, was so much more powerful than China. Now the power balance in favor of China has become so much stronger. So even though there is now what appears to be some kind of a quasi-alliance between China and Russia, it is not a comfortable alliance at all. And indeed, if you read, if I'm not mistaken, Madame Fu Ying, who's one of China's most outspoken female diplomats, actually wrote somewhere in an article which I remember reading, saying that China and Russia are not allies in the traditional sense. So, if indeed you had more creative diplomacy on the part of United States or on the part of Europe, I can see a disengagement away between China and Russia. But of course, that means, and this is the hard part, you've got to make hard compromises. You've got to stop pushing NATO all the way up to the borders of Russia. And you've got to understand what are Russia's core interests and what are the areas in which they cannot be seen to be weak. At the same time, there's also the personal dimension, which is that Putin has become demonized in many ways in the West, and because he's become demonized in the West, it's very difficult to deal with someone like him. But I always remind people that in World War II, when Winston Churchill decided that his number one enemy was Hitler, he suddenly became a good friend of Stalin. And I quoted in my book a scene of Winston Churchill and Stalin drinking wine together, enjoying bonhomie and so on and so forth. So if in World War II you could have the West working with Stalin, I think in today's environment, logically, the West should explore the possibilities of also working with Putin. But the problem here is that there's a deep tradition of political correctness that is involved in American decision-making. And that makes it harder to make the sort of hard strategic decisions. But I wouldn't be surprised if at some point Russia drifts and begins to take a more independent position. But of course, whether or not that can happen will depend on the attitudes towards Russia and the Biden administration. And I think both Richard and Cliff probably have a better sense of it than I do, frankly. Yeah.
Professor Mahboubani, when you said China won, you mean that United States cannot catch with? I mean, this is ultimate winning.
What does China want? I think you see from the Chinese point of view, and remember that one of the hardest things to understand about the Chinese is that all of us look at the world through our own historical lenses, okay? And from the Chinese point of view, the most important thing to know about the Chinese is about the century of humiliation that they suffered from 1842 to 1949. And that's the main driving force in the Chinese psychology. And what the Chinese want is to ensure that they're never again, ever humiliated, ever. And so, which is why, if you want to understand why they feel strongly about Hong Kong, well, Hong Kong was seized by the British because the Chinese refused to take opium from the British. And then if you want to know why they feel strongly about Taiwan, it's because the Japanese took Taiwan away in 1895, where the moment when China was very weak. So to in a sense overcome that century of weakness and to be treated with respect is, I think, the key driving force for the Chinese. I don't think the Chinese have any desire to go out and replace the United States in taking over a kind of a global role and run the world order and to play a global leadership. That's not their aspiration at all. I think they be, at the same time, I must emphasize, China will behave like any great power world. Any great power one will want to have its way on the issues that are important to it, and China will become a bully. No question whatsoever. When you develop bigger muscles as a great power, you become a bully, and you have to, and especially the neighbors of China will have to learn to live with a much more assertive China. But I always make a distinction between an assertive China and an aggressive China, because the Chinese, I think, have decided that using the military force is not their number one method of achieving their strategic goals. So the Chinese will be driven with their agenda. But at the same time, if you can come to them with a deal, they'll be pragmatic enough to accept it. But clearly, I agree that managing China will be the number one challenge for the Biden administration.
Thank you. Cliff, I know Russia is your area of expertise, but would you like to comment on what Professor Mahboubian said, or?
Sure. The Russia relationship is going to be not a good one at all under Biden. Authoritarian government, the election of Donald Trump sticks in, I think, all Democrats' brains. The legacy of Ukraine, I mean, he was in the government, he was part of that policy, bitterness towards Ukraine, cyber attacks, bounties on US troops, alleged killing of his opponents, Navalny most recently. There's a long list of reasons that I think Joe Biden and his administration are going to have it out for Russia. The other thing I would say is that, the Democratic Party, the staffing around Biden is going to be very hardline on Russia. I think they're nouveau hardline on China, but they're sort of long-standing hardline on Russia. Not that Biden's his own man, for sure. He has his own views, 40 years of foreign policy, but he's going to be surrounded by Russia hawks. Are they going to detonate the relationship with Russia? No. I mean, clearly there are responsible things that they have to adhere to, but I think financial sanctions on leaders becomes much more possible. As the press has covered, there is the ability to leak or to just even state allegations of corruption by Russian leaders, which would be highly destabilizing, highly dangerous, I think, but could come under, I think it'd probably be a mistake, but could come under consideration by the Biden administration. So it's going to be a tense relationship.
Right. Many tough things. Richard, what are the options of the US president-elect in managing the economic crisis domestically, while at the same time trying to impose the rules of international game?
Well, I think they're going to try to make those consonant with one another. It is obvious when you step back from the COVID crisis that, in theory, this should be a cause for international cooperation, including between the United States and China, for example, right? Neither the United States or China has any interest in COVID spreading. We all have an interest in containing this thing. But if the past year is any prologue, I think the actual international cooperation is going to be pretty tough, and in U.S.-China cooperation on issues like COVID and these other things, even where we have a shared interest, is going to be pretty difficult, simply because we're in a competitive relationship and it's hard to carve out areas of cooperation. It's possible and it may be attractive. It's just difficult in practice. I think, as I said before, I think COVID's going to be their top priority, including the things that flow from that. So, for example, over the next few weeks, even before Biden is elected, I think you're likely to see a major economic package go through the Congress. The U.S. has already put about $2 trillion into the COVID recovery effort thus far, all of which has to be borrowed. And so I think you're likely to see another major package. They're just going to haggle over what the price tag is. And so the Biden administration will come in having a pretty big hole in the US budget deficit, and will attempt to both bring that down through reducing some expenditures, for example, in the defense budget and things like that, but also raising taxes. So they're going to do all of those things on the domestic front, I believe. And then on the international front, I think they will start with this notion of the United States as a more responsible actor in the world that is actively shaping the rules of the international order and abiding by them. And so, and enlisting other like-minded countries in the effort. Again, that may be easier said than done, because it all depends on what specific issues and rules you're actually talking about, and what countries are going to be with us or against us in that. But I think that will be the starting point for the kinds of things that they will want to see get done, and trying to work multilaterally through existing bodies, perhaps creating some new groupings and so forth, particularly on issues like technology, where there really is a divide between the United States and China in the way that both countries approach it, and try to have more like-minded countries on the side of where America comes down.
Richard, they're saying if there is no COVID-19, Trump would be winning the election. Do you think so?
Probably. I mean, if you look at how close this was, if there was no COVID-19, the economy, if you assume, would be roaring along the way it was until around January of this year, February of this year, where you had historically low unemployment, historically high markets, all of this. And the polling, the exit polling suggests that that Trump did get penalized for his handling of COVID-19. It's no stretch of the imagination to think that that may have made the difference. Now, that said, it's not a frivolous difference. I mean, Cliff and I are sitting here in the Washington area, and our country is racking up over 100,000 new infections per day, which means, 1 million every 10 days. I mean, so on the one hand, yeah, it's probably the case that Trump would have had a good shot at winning this thing had there been no COVID. On the other hand, COVID was the big test of presidential leadership, that for 4 years, everyone said, we will really see what this team is made of when we have a big crisis. Well, we got the big crisis. And, right now we're sitting here and the virus is essentially out of control.
Hi. I have a question for you, all of you. Now, it depends on how you look at it, internally or on the global level. Professor Kishore, do you think that Biden winning the election is a game changer on the international level?
Oh, I think definitely. I mean, huge difference. I mean, I can tell you from the point of view of a consumer. Okay, I mean, countries outside the United States are consumers of American power, I guess, or affected by American power. And dealing with the Trump administration, all of us tried to do our best to maintain good relations with the Trump administration, because we have traditional friendly ties, but it was very difficult. And I can tell you, for example, that for us, the priority in Southeast Asia is economic growth and development. And then Donald Trump launches his trade war against China in a very erratic fashion. Tariffs here, tariffs there, where there's no strategy, nothing behind that. So it was very disruptive. And frankly, right now, the priority, if you look at the countries in East Asia, like in the United States, the number one priority is dealing with COVID. They want to get rid of COVID. They want to kill COVID. And they want international cooperation to come back and kill COVID. So I can understand Richard's point about there being difficulty and hesitation in bringing that about. But if that can happen, that's the number one wish and aspiration of all the countries. Let's just work together to kill this thing completely and bring back the global economy to at least some kind of normal state. But, but at the same time, I must say that I'm glad that both Richard and Cliff have confirmed that Joe Biden wants to take a more multilateral approach. And that's what everybody in the region also wants to see, a more multilateral approach taking place in terms of managing the world. But what's interesting is that Cliff used the word and said it's a bipolar world. The Indian Foreign Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, who I suspect Cliff must know very well also, always emphasizes that we don't live in a bipolar world, we live in a multipolar world. I'm just telling you what the Indian Foreign Minister says all the time. So even in issues like that, you can get different perspectives. But at the end of the day, to answer your direct question, will the election of Joe Biden make a difference to the international environment? I think it can and will make a huge difference. But at the same time, managing China will be his number one challenge, and getting it right, I think, is absolutely critical. And there, it's actually possible or actually conceivable that things might get worse. You know, it's conceivable.
What do you think, Cliff?
No, I have a different take. I don't think the election of Biden is a game changer. I think that certainly the feeling is very different. I think the atmospherics, the game has definitely changed. But I would say for 4 reasons, I don't think it's a game changer. First, the system was bipolarity. It is bipolarity. The system hasn't changed. Secondly, for a country like the UAE, I think the game is still, how do I navigate a bipolar world? Can I continue with large oil sales to China alongside large defense purchases from the U.S.? For how long will that be viable? I think that's the question for foreign states. Third, I think that, if we look this in the eye, Joe Biden is unfortunately going to be likely to be a weak president. In that, at least if the Georgia runoff, if the Senate's going to go the way I think it will, if the Republicans win, he's going to have domestically his hands tied, which means I think we should look to foreign policy for where he's going to try to leave his mark, but he's not going to be very strong. And finally, the thing that I worry about the most, and again, if I were sitting where you are, Doctor, I'd worry about the most is U.S. credibility. So we just saw President Obama give way to President Trump. President Trump walked out of climate, walked out of JCPOA. Now, we're looking at Joe Biden. Okay, much better. It's morning in America and all that stuff. But who's going to come next time? Pompeo? Trump again? And what's going to happen to all the agreements that we've negotiated under Biden? In other words, what I don't think has changed is the need to assess and doubt and worry about U.S. commitment, given the domestic polarization, which will turn into a lot of flip-flops possibly on the international scene, and what that means for the international system. I think in some ways I'm more worried than I was before 70 million of my fellow citizens voted for Donald Trump.
So, Richard, this is on the internal level. Do you think it will make a big change, bearing in mind the 70 million voted for Trump? This is coming from the populist ground. Do you think this will change really? It will change something on the internal level?
Well, what's clear is that, and this was clear in 2016, but was ratified by the election in 2020, is that there's a large portion of the American population that is essentially dissatisfied with the post-Cold War trajectory of American foreign policy and American economic policy and outcomes. So there's a big section of the population that believes that they're losers from globalization. So as where many people see themselves as winners and see the net increase in prosperity and ultimately of jobs, the decline in prices of goods, all of this, there are people who see their jobs, whether they're in manufacturing or otherwise, go away. They're much less welcoming to immigration, both legal and illegal immigration. They are less enchanted of what we might call a muscular U.S. foreign policy that engages in military interventions, particularly in the greater Middle East, that don't have any sort of quick, ending point. And then there are the broader effects that, automation and other things that are not subject really to policy measures, but nevertheless are having broad economic changes. And so what you have is a dissatisfied portion of the American electorate, and it may sound strange for that relatively dissatisfied portion of the American electorate to vote for the incumbent, but I think that's exactly what happened, because it's less about Trump having delivered specific gains for people, as opposed to them feeling that over the past couple of decades, they've just been ignored and unrepresented by both Republicans and Democrats. And at least here was Donald Trump, who heard them, who could understand where they were coming from on these issues and articulated support for them and said that he would fight for them and that he wanted a fighter. The task for Joe Biden or for any president will be to try to craft policies and messages that appeal not just to the slightly more than half that voted for him, but for everybody else. And of course, Joe Biden has said as recently as yesterday, that's exactly what he wants to do. It's just easier said than done, because you're talking about two very different sets of perspectives on what is ultimately good for America and good for one's household and families and everything like that. It is a pretty divided country. And, it's going to be hard to sort of stitch that back together with a set of policies that the vast majority of Americans think is good for America on these hot button issues like trade, immigration, economic policy, domestic, economic policy, taxes, these other things. And that's before you get to all the social issues, which never go away as potentially divisive ones.
Thank you, Richard. I have also a question for three of you. What are the Professor Kishore, what are the international issues that would see detenting? What are the other issues that would see an escalation after the US election?
Well, I would say, let me try and speak from the point of view of Southeast Asia and where we are based. And here, the clear priority is, as I keep emphasizing, economic growth and development. That's the number one priority of all. So, for example, for the most important thing for us is trade agreements. And here, for example, if Joe Biden, I know it's unlikely, by the way, and I hope Richard and Cliff say I'm wrong. If Joe Biden can go back to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that would be amazing. That's what you call a game changer move. Because what it does is that it entrenches United States presence in East Asia in a fundamental way, in a very, very fundamental way, because you create an economic ecosystem that brings all the countries together. And it was very hard to negotiate that agreement, and countries like Vietnam and Malaysia bent over backwards to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So that will be a game changer, and that's something that would be great if the Biden administration can do. But as Richard was saying, there's such a strong consensus against globalization, against trade, against being losers, so it'd be very difficult to go back. But on the other hand, the regional comprehensive economic partnership, which has got, I think, 16 members now, 15 because India is not joining, that is going ahead. And if that goes ahead, then you create another ecosystem of trade in the region. But that ecosystem will now be based on China, right? China will become the biggest single trading animal within that system. And so, therefore, at the end of the day, if you want to decide whether in the long run, China's influence will be more in the region or United States influence will be more in the region will be determined not by the number of aircraft carriers or destroyers or whatever you have in the region. It will be determined by your economic presence and participation in this region. So there's a lot of focus on that. And the likelihood is that the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership will kick into action sometime next year. And the TPP is not likely to come about. But what makes it even more interesting is that at a recent conference a few months ago, Premier Li Keqiang actually said at a press conference that China is thinking of joining the remainder of the TPP, by the way, the comprehensive something or other partnership for the trade in East Asia. And if that happens, then frankly, the economic weight towards China will become far, far greater in this region. So it's important for people in Washington, D.C. to understand the game is not about guns and bombs. It's also about your economic presence and sort of a vibrancy in this region. I suspect, I don't know what Richard and Cliff think, but if someone like George Kennan were alive today, he would see that that's the real game in this region and not the military game that's most important in this region. So watch what's happening on the trade front, because that's where you see the real action. Just to give you one small statistic, which actually I found mind-boggling, okay? In the year 2000, this is completely outside, Brazil exported $1 billion a year of products to China, year 2000. By 2020, Brazil was exporting $1 billion every 72 hours to China. I mean, that's amazing. You can imagine. You have that kind of trade shift, obviously everything is going to change. And the trade volumes in this region, vis-a-vis China, and we don't have the charts, if you watch them, they'll rise significantly. And so you have a whole new network of economic interdependence in this region that is very important that the United States be a part of. It's very important. It's very important to US to, that's why I say it's important compared to GDP. So you ask me, what are we watching? We are watching the economic game.
I see. Cliff, please.
Well, this is on détente and escalation. Is that the question? Or TPP?
No, it's about it's the international issue that would. What are the international issues that would see detent, and what are the other issues that would see an escalation after the US?
Okay. Well, first of all, I agree with the professor on TPP, except it's just not going to happen. In the president, president-elect is not. It's just it's a political loser in this country, and I don't think it's in the cards. On détente and on escalation, I think China is ripe for at least a breathing space. I know that I think my colleagues would think a hard line is coming. We're at the point now where student visas, academic exchanges are all falling by the wayside, and I don't think that's something that Biden is going to support. With Iran, I think that they will make a real pass at a new Iran deal. I'm skeptical. We saw how hard it was the first deal on sunset clauses. I think it'll be easier said than done to get a good agreement, just like it was the first time around. Russia, we've talked about. Saudi Arabia, it's going to be a much more complicated relationship in a number of respects, and that's relevant to the region, to the UAE. And the third sort of escalation, I would say, is Turkey. From the Halk Bank Iran sanctions to the S-400 to Erdogan's economic policies, though today you got, cabinet reshuffle. I think Turkey is going to be a very, very difficult country, a very, very difficult relationship with the United States over the next 4 years. And that's one that deserves more attention than it's getting.
Richard?
Yeah, I agree with some of these. Just going back to Kishore's point about economic policy and the sort of strategic weight thereof. Yes, it's probably true that George Kennan, if he were writing today, would emphasize the importance of economic statecraft and the Indo-Pacific and all of that, including the TPP. The problem is that George Kennan never had to get himself elected to anything, and once you do, you got to sell that thing domestically. You don't have to sell, broad foreign policies. You do have to sell trade deals, so a trade deal has to be sold. Here on the trade front, we're going to see pretty soon what direction the Biden administration goes on. I generally am skeptical about how much trade progress is going to be made, but there's a world in which Joe Biden says, at least in his head, that he's going to be a one-term president and doesn't need to appoint a caretaker U.S. trade representative as Obama did in his first term and save all of the ambitious stuff for the second term. I mean, there was, at least in retrospect, trying to get TPP agreed by the Congress in the last week of an 8-year term, eight-year administration wasn't the best way of doing things. So if they want to be slightly more aggressive, whether it's TPP or anything else, a US-UK trade deal or anything else, then at least the opportunity is there. Although as Cliff I think is pointing out, the United States goes through sort of waves of protectionism and free trade, and we're in a pretty protectionist political moment right now. In terms of some of the other issues, I think with North Korea we're going to see escalation that then settles down to a détente. If past is prologue, and I think it probably is, the North Koreans escalate and provoke, and then there's no real solution to the underlying problem, which is North Korea being a nuclear power. We're not going to take those nuclear weapons away from them by force because of the dangers thereof. They're not going to trade them away for any big carrot. There's no stick big enough to get them to give them up. But we seem to have to go through the provocative phase before we settle down there. Similarly, on Saudi Arabia, as Cliff said, I think, look for a much, there you'll see, I think, a pretty dramatic shift from the Trump administration sort of full-throated embrace of the government in Saudi Arabia to differences over the war in Yemen, certainly still Khashoggi aftermath, and the approach to Qatar and to Lebanon and some other things. And so that's going to be a much frostier relationship from the very beginning, I think, with the Saudis. And then on Iran, I think what the administration is likely to do is go back into the JCPOA without condition, without negotiation. And then once it's in, start talking about what a follow-on to the JCPOA might look like that would extend some of the sunsets and things like that, and try to get into this conversation about what restrictions or some sort of mitigating effects on Iran's regional activities might look like. And I think the philosophy there is we, the Americans, need to sort of demonstrate that we're back, that we're acting in good faith, that we're good multilateralists, that we're back in this process. And then once we're in this process, then start to talk about the other problems that remain with respect to Iran. I think there's a pretty strong case to try to do that before you go back into the JCPOA, because your leverage is higher than once you're back in the deal, which is fundamentally what the Iranians want. But nevertheless, I think what is likely to trump there is on the Biden administration side is this desire to show that the United States is back and in accord with this agreement that was, of course, negotiated by some of the very people who are likely to go into a Biden administration.
Thank you, Richard. Before moving to the question from our viewers, it's a question and advice. Being coming from small country, Dr. Gergash, State Minister for Foreign Affairs, in his speech today, in the opening of ADST, he mentioned that our interest in multilateralism, and this is where that small states can survive. Dr. Kishore, being in Singapore, which has the same situation, there is a say that when the great power love each others, the grasses suffer. And when they also fight against each other, also the grasses suffer. I believe the small countries are the grass, and we suffer in both ways. So what is your advice, Professor Kishore?
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. I completely agree with Dr. Gagash when he says that from the point of view of small states, it's in their interest to have more multilateralism, because more multilateralism means a more rules-based environment. A more rules-based environment means a safer environment for small states. By the same time, I want to add a very important qualification here. And I've now cited this speech many times, and I'm surprised that very few Americans cite it. This is a speech that President Bill Clinton gave in Yale in 2003. And he said something very significant in that speech. He said, if America is going to be number one forever, then America can keep on doing whatever it's doing. You know, it's you're number one. You can do what you want. You can have a unipolar world. You can live with it, and so on and so forth. But then he added a but. He said, but if you can conceive of a world where United States is no longer number one, then surely it is in America's interest to strengthen multilateral rules, multilateral norms, multilateral processes, multilateral institutions that will then, if we didn't say this explicitly, constrain the next number one, which is going to be China. And I actually agree that would be the smartest strategy for the United States to use to actually constrain China. Is not to go for a one-to-one contest with China, is to create a multilateral rules-based environment that will create rules that at the end of the day that China will also have to follow. So I actually think, I was ambassador to the UN altogether 10.5 years, and I found it very sad. I mean, I got along very well with my American counterparts, General William Walters, Gene Kirkpatrick, Richard Holbrooke, John Negroponte. I was good friends with all of them. But at the same time, the United States policy was not to strengthen multilateralism, but to weaken multilateralism. In fact, some of them were quite open to me. They say, we can understand why you small states like all these rules. For us, these rules are an encumbrance. So I think if under the Biden administration, I think Richard and Cliff said this might happen, if there's a greater emphasis on multilateralism, I think it doesn't. My point is that it just doesn't serve the interests of small states. It also now serves the interests of the United States also. And oh, by the way, incidentally, Europe is very much on board in favor of multilateralism, and most of the world is very much in favor of it. And paradoxically, which future historian, but right now, as of now, China is still in favor of multilateralism. So we have a window of opportunity where if everybody can agree, then there's one way if we have one silver bullet to make the world a better place, that silver bullet is multilateralism.
Absolutely right. This is multilateralism. It is a win-win game rather than zero-sum game. Cliff, please.
Well, I make 2 points. First, if I were advising a small country, my first pearl of wisdom would be to focus on tomorrow's multilateralism, not yesterday's multilateralism. And by that, I mean to gauge those multilateral fora where the Biden administration is likely to be particularly intent, interested, and active. The D10, the group of democracies that Biden is thinking about activating. The Paris Accords, probably an Iran deal, cyber, and other sort of next generation, tomorrow's multilateral forums. Those are the ones that if I was a small state, I'd try to become either centrally or at least peripherally quite active in. The second thing I would say is be realistic. I mean, multilateralism is something of a paradox. In a world where, as we talked about, the international system, the international structure is one where two countries matter a lot more than all the rest of the countries. And I think not deeply internalizing that and making policy based on that would lead to policy failure. And the most important things that I would come up with, which I don't think are out there as much as they will be, is what I would say the three global sectors that are really going to become, if not already, bifurcated. High tech, healthcare, and data. Data privacy is exploding around the world. So I think to craft an effective foreign policy, small states like Abu Dhabi need to both join the new multilateralism and be very realistic about where choices need to be made.
Richard?
Yeah, I think multilateralism is certainly an attractive ideal, and I think a Biden administration will pursue it. But not all multilateralism is equal, right? So it's not the same thing to say, on the one hand, as I think the Biden administration will, and as the president-elect has said he would like to do, to get the democratic leaders of the world together in a major summit and talk about what's possible in terms of cooperation. That's not the same thing as going to the UN Security Council and saying that the United States and China won't act absent some agreement in the Security Council, right? Particularly when the US and Russia and China often don't agree at the Security Council, and therefore, COVID is a good example of where for weeks and weeks and weeks, the Security Council couldn't even issue a statement because there was a fight over whether to put in a sentence in the statement about the origin of coronavirus, right? So here's our preeminent international law-making multilateral body that is paralyzed, and I don't think there's going to be any real change in that over the next few years, no matter who is in the chair in the White House. It's we saw over the course of the Cold War when the great powers are fighting with each other. Yeah, there's always niche issues where you can find some area of agreement and do some work in the UN Security Council, but the default setting is that it's just paralyzed given the veto or the inability to do that. So what I think you're likely to see is multilateralism not in some of the traditional structures of multilateralism. The UN agencies, even if the United States rushes back, as I think it will, into the WHO, it's hard to see the WHO as sort of the premier venue through which the United States conducts its international health activities, maybe. But what I think you're likely to see is new, more kind of flexible structures and ones that emphasize things that can advantage the United States or sort of accrue to the values of the United States. So democratic groupings, groups of like-minded technology powers that have kind of the same values and that are similarly concerned about, the kind of Chinese values that are embedded in some of the export of its technology and its technology policies. Certainly on climate, a much more universal approach, given the kind of, values and interests, more neutral aspect of that. But, even under kind of a nice guy, Joe Biden, multilateralist administration, I wouldn't look for some rush back to the United States, going to the UN for a lot of things or anything like that. I just don't think that that's realistic any more than it would be of China going to the UN and saying, well, we'd like to act somewhere in the world, but let's go to the Security Council and see what it thinks before we do so. I know from a small country perspective, it'd be great, if great powers sort of structured all of their big moves in accordance with rules that are made by multilateral bodies where, the small countries themselves had a seat at the table, but I just don't think that's realistic.
All right, I'll move to the Q&A from our viewers. And there is a question from Mohammed Baharul. It's for Cliff, but feel free if you want to comment on that, Richard or Kisha. So he's saying, do you see the world order still operate on the polarity or gravitational force of superpowers, or it is more networked, where connectivity is the driving dynamic? How would such a change affect the concept of strategic competition, especially in this region?
This one's for me?
Yeah, this is for Cliff, but if you want to comment, but this is
Okay.
addressed to.
Oh, go. Sorry, Cliff, I didn't hear. Go ahead.
No, it's fine. I'd be interested to see what you think too. It's a great question. To me, the nature of any system is fundamentally set. So look, what we political scientists sometimes make the mistake of doing is there are lots of different reasons, lots of different causes of outcomes. And in order to increase the explanatory power of any one, you've got to push that one as far as you can. So I think the most important determinant of outcomes is the distribution of capabilities, mostly military, economic, and also soft power among states. Now, that's not to say that leadership beliefs or connectivity or any of the other inputs that affect state behavior are irrelevant, because they're not. But I do, to get to the question, think that the most important driver, by far, the most important driver is the distribution of capabilities. And then you have power indices, and you have, sort of rankings of states. And we go back to the fundamental premise that Kenneth Waltz wrote about a long time ago. Now, again, to open your Waltz textbook, crank it through, and send off your paper, that's a mistake. But as a first cut, I do think that polarity is a very important operating principle. And I would say it's important because when I'm in China and lots of other countries, the comeback when I give this talk is, oh, we're not for polarity. We prefer we would vote for a multipolar world. And it's not a question of what you vote for. It's a question of, if you look up at the sky on a clear day, you're going to see the sun or not? The answer is yes. So it's not a question of choice. It's a question of how the world works. So yes, I do think that the distribution of capabilities is the most important single factor out there. That polarity exists, like, again, gravity exists, but maybe the second, third, or fourth most, also important factor, if you're going to predict the full nature, it won't be very parsimonious or elegant, but it'll be more accurate. The full nature of outcomes would involve connectivity, would involve leaders' beliefs, would involve interdependence. So that's how I look at the world.
Most of the question, it's because we are in the Middle East. It's about Middle East foreign policy. But I will grab this question from Abdullah Sayed, and he is asking, what will change in the foreign policy compared to the legacy of President Obama? Would you like to take this, Richard, or Kishore?
Sure, I'll give that a shot. I think that is a major question, which is you have a team that will be coming in, many, if not all of whom served in the Obama administration. And do they aspire for a return to the pre-Trump status quo ante? Is the gold standard the final year of the Obama administration or something like that? And I think the answer is no. But it's one of these questions where it's complicated, because when you talk to our friends who are likely to go into positions of responsibility, there's a widespread acknowledgement that the world has changed over 4 years, that the country has changed over 4 years. And so it's not just about a restoration and sort of wiping the Trump experience out of our national memory and returning to a foreign policy that looks like, the Obama administration, but rather one that's based on renewal, and it is tailored for the world and the country we're in. So what does that mean in practice? Well, I think the biggest thing it means in practice is a different disposition with respect to China. I mean, as late as the end of the Obama administration, there still was a disinclination by the US government to label China a strategic competitor. There still was the engage and hedge strategy, where the United States would seek to engage China as sort of greatly as possible on the economic side, while still hedging its bets by networking its security matters and everything with countries in the region. That's gone out the window among Republicans and Democrats. And I don't think there's a return to the old version of that. I think what you're seeing instead is a widespread acknowledgement, including among people who will go into the Biden administration, that we are in a long run competition with China across multiple domains: military, economics, diplomacy, technology, ideas and ideology, you name it. And while that shouldn't exclude areas of cooperation on shared goals, that we're going to be much more competitive in nature than we were before. So that's one. The other is on Russia. The United States and Russia didn't get along very well toward the end of the Obama administration. But post the 2016 interference in American political life, I think you're likely to see an even frostier relationship between Moscow and Washington, with no chance that that's going to sort of come in from the cold anytime in the future. And then you're going to see a different approach, I think, probably unfortunately on trade, because, you know, at the end of the Obama administration, it was quite aggressively pushing TPP, and this was going to be the bleeding edge potentially of TTIP, transatlantic trade and investment partnership and things like that. And, you know, unfortunately, those aspirations seem to have gone out the window in favor of at least bilateral trade deals, or sort of upgrades to things like NAFTA and things like that, or maybe just nothing for a while. And then I think the last thing is, and this is really an open question, with respect to sort of the US role in the greater Middle East, particularly the military role. You know, there were aspirations throughout the Obama administration and then throughout the Trump administration of just getting out of conflict zones, you know, withdrawing all the troops from Iraq, which of course Obama did until he had to send them back, not getting involved in Syria until of course Obama did and sent them in, you know, getting involved in Libya, but then not trying to avoid being on the ground, setting deadlines for the withdrawal in Afghanistan. Those were all Obama things. And a lot of that was sort of repeated in the Trump term. You know, let's get out of Syria, tried to do it twice, still there. You know, step up the number of troops in Iraq, say that we're going to end the quote forever war in Afghanistan. And yet here we are with troops in Syria and Iraq and Afghanistan, and, you know, and challenges are not going to be met by others in the Middle East. And here I think you may see a more realistic approach by a Biden administration. Says, yeah, the overall objective is for the United States to not put service people into harm's way in these countries, but we've got to think hard about what the conditions are by which we actually withdraw and the timeline associated with it. So those are some of the areas where I think you could see some pretty significant changes.
Thank you, Richard. We covered most of those questions, but I assure our viewers we have the next session. It's about the impact of the new administration on the Middle East. The last question goes to Professor Mahboubani. Does China looking for taking U.S. a role in the world?
No, I think the Chinese have absolutely no desire. I mean, I'm glad that Richard did a brilliant description of how both the Obama administration and the Trump administration wanted to get out of Middle East, Syria, Iraq, Libya, and then ended up staying on for whatever reasons. And frankly, if I this is of course politically incorrect to say, from the Chinese point of view, the more the United States gets involved in Syria, Iraq, Libya, it's a gift to China. And in fact, frankly, you know, when there was a moment when the Trump administration was thinking of bombing Iran, I was certain that the champagne bottles would pop in Beijing the minute the United States bombed Iran, because it's another geopolitical gift to China. And so from the Chinese point of view, they are actually very, very puzzled. Why is the United States fighting all these wars? How does the United States gain from all this? But it's good for China that the United States is so engaged in that way. But from the Chinese point of view, what they would like actually at the same time, the Chinese, because of their culture, history, 4,000 years of history, the one thing they fear the most is chaos. They just don't like chaos. They want order. And which is why in the domestic contract, the domestic social contract within China is the opposite of the domestic social contract in the United States of America. In the United States of America, individual freedom is the #1 value, and people want to make sure that nothing sacrifices individual freedom. In the case of China, what's most important is to preserve order and stability, because when there's no order and stability, the people in China suffer. So globally, the #1 goal of the Chinese is just to have stability and predictability. Because right now, there is a global platform, a set of rules-based platform that has enabled the Chinese people to enjoy the best 40 years in 4,000 years of Chinese history. Okay, the past 40 years have been remarkable. From the Chinese point of view, the global order is not broken at all. It's doing quite fine. They're doing very well with it, and they're growing, and their influence is spreading. And people, what you do get, and so that there are lots of mistakes the Chinese have made. But if you take, for example, on the positive side, when you have an initiative like the Belt and Road Initiative, out of 193 countries, 127 countries have signed up to join the Belt and Road Initiative. And then when China sets up the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, I forget how many, 80, 90 countries have joined now. So there are all kinds of Chinese initiatives where countries are participating in it. So the Chinese view is we will work with the current order, we will build an alternative that we have also. But overall, the end goal is to preserve as much of order and stability as possible. The Chinese don't like surprises. They don't want to sing. So in that sense, if the United States goes towards a more multilateral approach, I think the Chinese will be happy to work with a multilateral approach. So the Chinese, at this stage, and I must emphasize, okay, the Chinese are still in the growth phase, next 20, 30 years. Now, what happens when they have a GNP that's twice the size of the United States? Now, that's a different ballgame. That's a different ballgame. But for the next 10, 20 years, the Chinese don't want to disrupt the global order. They're quite happy with the way it's going, and they'll preserve it as long as possible. So I always believe that what the United States today has a window of opportunity to work out a strategy now while it can to try and influence China as much as possible so that it continues on this order multilateral track and keep it engaged on that track. And that's what basically the neighbors of China also want to see vis-a-vis China.
Do you agree, Cliff and Richard?
Richard?
I think the Chinese Communist Party likes order, and it likes an order that keeps it in charge, and it likes an order that keeps domestically the Uyghurs imprisoned if they have any possible disruption, and keeps Hong Kong unable to express its political views, if that would be seen as disruptive. And so it prefers a version of international order that, of course, it would believe to accrue to its benefits and try to drag certain rules and institutions in the direction of the preservation of the Chinese Communist Party in power and so forth. So to that degree, yeah, I guess I agree there. But it is hard, even if you look at this this year, with China essentially stirring up a border war with India, and taking dramatic steps in Hong Kong in violation of its internationally agreed commitments, and its military activities around the Senkakus, and sort of inciting greater anxiety in Japan, and putting in place economic coercive measures against Australia because Australia supported a independent inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus, and so essentially sanctioning the export of certain Australian products. You can sort of go around the world. It doesn't look like a country that's only bent on stability and preserving the status quo. It looks like one that is bent on preserving aspects of stability in the status quo that it think will benefit the prestige and stability of China, in particular the Chinese Communist Party, but wants to flex its muscles and intimidate or coerce those where it thinks it can do so without significant costs. So to me, it's more of a mixed bag.
If I could just add a few thoughts in closing. First, I saw the question, let me just say on polarity. And on the regional aspect, let me add just very quickly that I don't think in the Gulf region that polarity is as important as it is on a global scale. And I do think that connectivity is more important than it might be globally as a broad organizing principle. I'd also say that the impact on the region is this tug between the United States and China. Trading relationship with China, the U.S. is going to press the region, including the UAE, I think, on Huawei, and that's coming. So the polarity will reach into the region. On China, just again, very quickly and in closing, China, I don't think is revisionist like Russia. Russia really wants out of the global system. I don't think China does. But again, from the time I spent in China, which has been considerable recently, I do think the Chinese are slowly, quietly rising as a rule maker, not just a rule taker, but a rule maker. And in that way, I do think they're not the status quo power that some think they are. I think they're much more of a quiet, slow, time is on our side, agent for change in their favor. Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Professor Mahboubani, Cliff, Richard. Thank you very much. We had a wonderful discussion and wonderful debate. Thanks a lot. And we look forward to host you in Abu Dhabi if this pandemic left will leave us.
Yeah.
Inshallah, in a Biden way.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I want to thank Richard and Cliff also. It's been, I must say, I learned so much from both of you in terms of, I feel like I have a better understanding of what's going on in terms of the thinking of the people in the Biden administration, incoming administration. So I hope you're right in terms of their priorities.
So next year in Abu Dhabi, huh?
Yes, go ahead, Richard. Sorry.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I learned myself from all of you, and thank you very much. And I would just mention for our viewers that we have the next session after half an hour, which will answer all your question about Middle East, because we are looking to the US election and the Middle East. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.